Hey folks, it's been some time since I've painted a figure on this channel. After all the interior tanks and everything else we've got going on, I just figured I'd change it up a bit. And also, just show off what we can do with some colors other than green and brown. So today we're actually going to look at how I painted X-23 from X-Men. This is another beautiful sculpture from CA3D Studios. Why don't we see how we made this? We start as we always do with applying a black primer. I should note that I've already sanded down these parts and installed magnets in the limbs so they can be kept separate for shipping. Black primer is a great base to make sure the rest of your paint layers hold. We're going to do something quite different with this model, which is called pre-shading, which is literally the opposite of post-shading, which you see me do on my tank models quite often. I don't typically pre-shade tanks because the most common method of pre-shading is the black and white method, which desaturates the base coat, like we will see on this base. This desaturation is no big deal on a flat green vehicle that'll be covered in weathering or on this base, but on the vibrant figures we want to keep things saturated, so we will use a pre-shading method that I'll call the complementary method. I haven't seen this term coined anywhere, so I'm going to give it this name. Let's finish up this base and then I'll go over that technique in more detail. For now, we're going to use the dry brush pre-shading technique that is often used by miniature modelers. Using a dry brush, we're going to apply some light gray highlights on the ground. Now it may look like stone, but it is snow, so we're going to pre-shade with cold colors like gray and blue. When we cover up with white, it'll give us some highlights while the black primer will create subtle gray shadows. We can use the same technique on this stump. Dry brushing will bring out the bark edges. After some masking with putty, I'll use an earth color and apply in thin layers so we can take advantage of the dry brushed highlights. I'll add some lighter wood tones to the exposed top of the stump. And then I'll use the same wood tones on the slashes on the stump that are represented by the exposed wood from our protagonist's adamantium claws. This is a simple method for creating realistic wood textures. You could go further, but this isn't about a stump. Let's move on to the victim of our scene. Disclaimer, no real bears were injured during the painting of this scene. Let's dry brush this fur with a bright rust color. If this scares you, you're really going to be scared when I show you the complementary method. Now we can spray our brown on this grizzly and see how the orange highlights the brown. If we used white, we would get a light gray brown because the brown would turn white or desaturate. The orange keeps the brown, well, brown, and we get some natural looking highlights. Now let's deal with the gory bits of our victim. Let's start with some yellow dry brushing this time. This will create our highlights again without desaturation. I tried transparent red here, but I wasn't happy with the results. Then I remembered I had gotten some blood colors some time ago. This one specifically is Flesh Terror's Red. And the name fits, so let's go with that. The transparency of these contrast paints from Citadel make them perfect for this bloody effect. They even have a glossy sheen to them. After I was satisfied with those results, I carried this to the slashes on the face of the bear and its jaw. I think these results are quite nice, but our bear looks out of place on a clean white snow base. So let's fix that with one of my favorite weathering techniques in armor modeling, speckling. Well, I guess in this case, splattering, since it's blood from our friend who made the unfortunate decision to cross a lady with adamantium claws. For this technique, I thinned down some Citadel paint, the same stuff I used on the gory bits. And I just thinned it down with some water, loaded it onto a brush, and then blasted it with air from the airbrush. I repeated this process until I built up the effect and it fits the scene. I then used a brush to blend the edges directly under the bear so it kind of looked like it was pooling, and I also created some streaking effects down the sides of the base. You see how armor modeling techniques can be used on figures? If you're new here and curious what I'm talking about, check out the links in the description to my armor builds. If you want dirty models, then there's nothing dirtier than a fully weathered piece of armor. With the base out of the way, we can focus on the figure and that complementary pre-shading method I mentioned earlier. Let's start with her feet, which are mostly painted blue. Blue is one of the few colors that won't desaturate badly if you decide to shade it with black and white, but where's the fun in that? We're here to try something different. Well, kind of different. We'll start with the typical white zenithal highlights, as white is the only color that will lighten blue without changing the color. But now we have the black and white model. Typically we would start painting at this point, but blue is so close to black that this model would just look black. So we want to use red to cover the black. Wait, did he just say red? It's a blue model. Well, yeah, we know from our color wheel, or color circle, that red is the complementary color to blue. This means that it is directly opposite the color wheel and will create saturated shadows because we're adding color to color. When we paint transparent blue over red, it actually turns a beautiful shade of purple, which is much prettier to look at than black. Now it may seem weird at first because you'll think you'll want to put a dark red down, but that isn't the case. You actually want to use a vibrant red to color in all the black areas. In other words, you want to cover up all the black primer with bright red or white. That way we have nice transitions. Now let's do the same thing on her main body, but let's start with yellow this time. You've all seen me do this trick back when I painted Rogue. Links in the descriptions as always. Start with white from the top because white's the only color that will lighten yellow. Then we use bright pink from the bottom to create shadows. Red darkens yellow, but we don't want the shadows to be too dark on yellow, so we use pink. Now, you can use red and it will turn it more brown, but we want our yellow to turn more orange because, again, we want a saturated shadow, not a desaturated shadow. And when I say saturation, I mean vibrancy. It's another word for it. I want bright colors. When you spray transparent yellow over this pre-shading, you get these nice natural orange shadows, which is beautiful. Then we can use the same white and red shading technique on the blue parts of this body to add highlights and shadows to those wonderfully sculpted curves. This technique works for any color. If you haven't looked at a color wheel before, I highly recommend it so you can take advantage of this simple pre-shading technique that makes highlights and shadows all but effortless without having to desaturate your colors. With the main colors applied, it's time for some detailed brush painting. I like to work from the bottom up so I can assemble the model as I go. So it's back to the feet as we have the yellow parts to paint at the seams. I started by painting the seam white. Then I covered the white with the same transparent yellow color that I used before so I could keep the colors all congruent. This way we don't have too many shades of the same yellow and the figure will look uniform. After the yellow seams, we had some black details to paint on the sides. If you like the black outlines, you're going to love the next step. If not, well, get ready because this model has many of these black outlines. But first, let's get some satisfaction by putting those feet on the base. Okay, now we can move on. As I said, there's plenty of black outlines on the main body. Let's just accept it and move on. How about her belt? Leather brown seems like a fitting color, so let's try that. Her buckle is gold, so as I do with all metallics, I painted it black first, then gave it a coat of Atom Gold. The X-Men logo can be a little tricky because it's tight quarters, but it's doable. Oh, quarters. It's an X with 4 parts. Oh, I didn't even try that one, really. Anyway, let's paint the black sections white so we can then paint it red. Don't worry if your brush skills aren't perfect. You can cover up with gold as needed. Time for more satisfaction with setting the body on the base. Great. Now let's finish up those claws. For the adamantium silver, I'm going to use white aluminum from AK Extreme Metals because the results from an airbrush simply can't be matched. Again, the blades need to be painted black to start, then we spray silver. Now for the most involved piece. That face with the mask and lush black hair. In typical modeling fashion, you want to start with the largest surface area and work your way down to the smaller details, so let's start with that hair. Now, anytime your main color is black, you have to get creative or else you'll end up with a black blob with no contrasting features. In this case, we're going to use a dry brush on her hair so that we have strands of highlights. You can see that I tried a gray highlight, but I wasn't happy with it, so I chose to dry brush again. I thinned some black paint and added 2 drops of transparent blue. The blue transparent paint won't be noticeable, but it'll help to thin out our black paint and keep it transparent. That way we don't just cover up the highlights with black and lose contrast. The trick is to use thin, light coats to build up the black without completely covering the highlights. I see so many artists use an airbrush and cover everything in one thick coat, and the results can be disastrous. So I recommend using thin coats. You can hand brush all of this and then highlight to your content like you would on a miniature figure. But if you want to try to airbrush as much as possible to get nice even coats, this is a nice way to do it. Now we're going to apply the same complementary pre-shading as before on the mask, starting with the white and pink pre-shading followed by yellow. Then we're going to move on to the white and red pre-shading followed by blue. You may have some cleanup to do depending on the quality of your masking, so just repeat the same process with a brush as needed. Again, as I say, with some of these smaller parts, maybe you don't even want to bother with an airbrush and masking. Quite frankly, I thought about it afterwards, and I think the next time I do a model like this, I probably will just brush this. But you have to be very careful with how you thin out your paint before you brush, because that can also lead to some other types of disastrous results. So again, use whatever you're comfortable with. Next, we have the small portion of her face that's not covered by her mask. You've seen this technique used with an airbrush on my previous figures like Rogue and Magic, and even with brush painting on the Sherman figure. Links in the description for you if you haven't already watched those videos. We start with a white surface, then highlight pink and shadow with red. Next, we pick our base color and spray from above. Again, focus on thin coats. We're building up layers and blending as we go. The next coat is slightly lighter than the first. Then we use a light skin tone to highlight near the top. Next, we want to blend the shadow areas using a pinkish tone along the bottom of her chin and along the top of her mask. Again, this figure doesn't show a lot of skin, so if you want to see this technique on a larger surface, check out Magic since she has much more skin surface showing. Now on to the mouth. For the inside, we will use a reddish flesh color throughout, including her tongue. Then her teeth, I'll use a deck tan, as it's a nice light color that won't make her look like she just pulled a teeth whitening strip off. Then I highlight with white. Now for the finishing touch, which is the eyes. One nice thing is that with her mask on, there's no pupil, so that simplifies things. We're going to start with a black background, and then we're also going to paint the eyelashes sticking out, and then we'll use white for the eyes. You can clean up any mishaps with black, and then you're all set. Now for that oh so satisfying final edition and the turntable finish. What do you all think? Have you learned anything new? Let me know in the comments while I show some high resolution photos in the background and tell you how you can add this model or one like it to your collection. As I mentioned, I painted this model for a client, and you can have your very own model too by checking out my own personal website where you can select a model from my library or request a custom commission. The cool part is that I'll record a video for YouTube for each new model that I paint, so it's like your own personal episode of how it's made. Please go ahead and check out my website at relentlessstormmodels.com. My work is also available on Etsy and eBay, so you can definitely find me there as well. Just look for Relentless Storm and you'll find my stores. But it does help me out a lot if you actually purchase from my store directly. Check out my stores, see what's available, and if you don't see something that you want, then just send me a message and I will see if I can find it for you. I'd be happy to hunt down an STL and print one that matches exactly what you're looking for to add to your collection. If you want to get 10% off, just use code STORMYT2024. Want to save more? Well, my patrons are getting an additional 10% off as a thank you for supporting my work and this channel. Speaking of, my Patreon is like a personal magazine subscription where you get updates almost daily from my workbench, along with insights into my builds and some great high-resolution photos. We can connect through direct messages in case you have any questions or anything on your mind that you'd like to discuss. I have plenty more figures coming away and armor models, so I hope you'll join me for that. Until next time, stay safe, keep learning, and make sure to build your models, not just your stash. Cheers!